Today, in the year 2022, 8 billion people live on this world. Environmentally, you will find in the 6 inhabited continents people which differ in their appearance and partly in their language from each other. These differences are sometimes more, sometimes less strong. In this film, I would like to talk about the continent from which in recent history the most global influence emanated: Europe. At least nowadays, almost all Europeans belong to the Indo-European ethnic group. However, the name Indo-European is only the modern term for this language family. The Indo-Europeans themselves at that time, of course, did not know this word. The common ancestry of the Indo-Europeans ensures that the appearance and partly also the language of the respective peoples resemble each other, sometimes more, sometimes less. The only 3 ethnic groups that do not speak an Indo-European language are the Hungarians, the Finns, and the Maltese. They speak a Finno-Ugric, the latter even a Semitic language. Nevertheless, the Finns and the Hungarians are still Indo-Europeans, even if their language cannot be classified in the Indo-European language family. So how can it be that, for example, Spaniards and Icelanders have a common ancestry when they hardly resemble each other? How can it be that the most Northern Europeans differ from the most Southern Europeans optically so much that no one would ever suspect a common ancestry? To answer this question, we have to travel back 5,000 years into the past, to the area of Sumeria. This is the heartland of modern man. All peoples and cultures from this world found their beginning, and where these people came from is not important in order to be able to understand this film. Emergence theories such as evolution or creationism are responsible for this, not this film. The rest of the world was empty at that time. No one lived there. And apart from ancient Egypt, the archaeological finds which are available to us can offer us a detailed trace only up to approximately 3000 BC. Anything beyond that is based on theories and speculations that cannot be proven. Only ancient Egypt is, as I said, a special case and will get a more detailed explanation around the end of this film. Why only towards the end? Well, it is in my opinion for the chronological understanding better so. But trust me when I say that those facts are simply breathtaking. But now back to the main text. These pseudo-theories of the pre-Sumeric periods, such as the Chalcolithic or Neolithic, together with their cultures, are nothing more than nice theories. However, they are not facts. Exactly for this reason, this documentary refers exclusively to the time era that started from the time of the old Sumerians. But those people back then did never call themselves in such a way. They didn't have a self-designation. The term Sumerians was implemented centuries later by the ancient Akkadians.
These people were, by the way, humans, which we would assign today to the so-called white race. They were blue-eyed, light-skinned, and blonde or red-haired. Critics, on the other hand, argue that they have proofs for the existence of certain peoples that lived far, far before the establishment of the Sumerian state. The Aztecs, Maya, Maori, and so on. And I must say, with the exception of Egypt, because Egypt is a very specific topic, those theories are objectively nothing more than wild speculations. Indeed, these tribes lived on this planet, but only way later. Look, you cannot tell the people out there that some archaeologists had found, for example, somewhere on an island in the ground, 2 clay pots and a skull bone, tested them with the very faulty C14 method, only to claim thereafter that we know that on this island lived an ancient civilization around 10,000 years ago. This is nonsense. This is wishful thinking, because the proofs for such a theory are missing. That's why we realistic thinking scientists say from 3000 BC, yes. From then on we can speak of facts, because we have many archaeological findings and also writings that proved the whole thing very well. Everyone who wants to prove something before 3000 BC will fail, that's for sure.
From about 2700 BC, the world changed dramatically. Within a few years, many new empires emerged. Meanwhile, the population of Sumeria continued to decrease. It can be assumed that the descendants of the so-called Sumerians moved away and founded new tribes. The Cimmerians, Mitannis, Ionians, Tabalians, Lydians, and the Tersenians in Anatolia, the Mushki in the today's North India, the Elamites, Assyrians, Urfakistimes, Canaanites, and Amarians in the Near and Middle East, as well as the Cushites, Futs, and Mizraims in Africa. These were the first recorded peoples after the fall of the first Sumeria. Historically, it is not clear why the first Sumeria fell. The biblical accounts are all what is available for us historians in this regard. It says that God punished mankind after they wanted to build a tower to put themselves on a par with God. As punishment, God distributed mankind out of the area, confused their language, and changed later also partly their appearance. And the foundation of this tower was found according to some archaeologists in today's Iraq. However, it is scientifically not conclusively clarified whether this story is historically correct or not. But the things become even more interesting when you also keep in mind that in the Old Testament of the Bible, strangely, the names of the first few descendants of the three sons of Noah, the man who survived the worldwide flood, are very similar to the names of the first historical tribes after the fall of the first Sumeria. The Old Testament is even incredibly accurate in this regard. Now, many people will surely ask themselves, but where are all the ancient peoples from our history books? Where are the ancient Greeks, Romans, Persians, and so on? Well, first of all, they came to light way later, and secondly, you have to know that these terms are not correct at all. The Greeks are only called Greeks because there was once a ruler whose name was Graecos, and his people were renamed after him, in Graeci, Greeks. In the case of Graecos, the people of the Mycenes, which were descendants of the Ionians, which I have already mentioned before, had to sacrifice their own tribal name because of the egocentric goals of the ancient Graecos. The self-proclaimed son of Zeus fulfilled thereby his dream to be the founder of his own new tribe. In the old days, for the ruling caste, it was all about self-realization. A brother of Graecos was called Latinus, and he, you probably already guessed it, renamed his people after himself too. This is how the Latins came into existence later, and the ancient Persians were also renamed by a ruler called Persus, and so on. But these renaming processes all took place somewhat later. Therefore, I want to go back to the point where we talked about the first wave of new peoples after the fall of the first Sumeria. The six people of the Cimmerians, Mitannians, Ionians, Tabalians, Mushki, and Tersenians are the people we must primarily focus on when we want to talk about the Europeans. According to the Old Testament, these six peoples descended from Japheth, a son of Noah. Thus, these peoples are so-called Japhetites. They never defined themselves with this term, but historically they can definitely be called so because it is not a false generic term. And exactly those few peoples we have to give our attention a little more precisely, because it is specifically about the Europeans in this film. And no, this documentary is of course no Bible seminar, it is about historical facts, and the Bible served in the past many historians as a reliable source. Whether you consider the Bible to be God's word or not is absolutely irrelevant in this context. I would like to speak first of all more detailed about the so-called Japhethitic tribes. The so-called Japhethitic tribes were the ancestors of almost all Europeans. It has been historically proven that the Merovingians, the oldest noble family in the later Franks, believed that they were the descendants of the Cimmerians and the Scythians. Please remember the term Scythian, because this will be later relevant. The Roman historian Flavius Josephus also held the opinion that the European peoples are the descendants of the ancient Japhetites. The Japhethitic people initially settled from southeastern Europe to what is now India. They spoke one language, the so-called Proto-Indo-European. Excavations have shown that in the entire settlement area of the Japhetites, one symbol was suspiciously common, a 4C-type symbol.
This symbol was found everywhere, from the Balkans to Anatolia to northern India, on their sculptures, on their coins, and so on. This shows the unity of these peoples, the common ancestry. The Eastern Romans, which are nowadays wrongly called Byzantines, took that symbol as their coat of arms too. The question now is, what is this symbol? What did it mean and why was it so relevant?
To solve this riddle, let's take another look at the Old Testament. It is written that Noah, the man who survived the flood with his 3 sons, had received visions from the future from God. How far-reaching these visions were is not described. However, it would be possible that Noah got to see the complete later biblical descriptions and revelations of God, because in the Bible, the end times are described in such a way that Jesus will come back with a sickle in his hand to quote, harvest, and the name Japheth means, translated, spreading out. Now, let's put 1 and 1 together. Jesus comes back in the end times with a sickle, and the word Japheth means to spread out. Spread out like in all 4 directions. Many words in our language are based on the sound that certain objects are producing. And in the old days, there was no difference between a sickle and a scythe. It is basically the same tool used to cut grass. The only difference is that a scythe is slightly larger than a sickle. Now listen carefully to the sound.
Sirp, sirp, sirp. That's exactly the sound you make when you work with a scythe or a sickle. And at that time, we humans relied in our linguistics on the tones which certain objects or even living beings were making. Perhaps a little primitive, I know, but that's our history.
All European peoples, according to most historians, have a direct or indirect connection with a certain ancient people, which historians like to call Scythians. Scythians in this context is nothing more than another word for the Japhetites. It is interesting that the word Scythians, of course, is derived from the word scythe. The fact that many historians do not want to consider is that the so-called Scythians never called themselves like that. But how did they call themselves instead? What were the name of the ancient Japhetites who settled from southern Europe to northern India? Well, we can read about it in one of the oldest writings in the world, the Rig Veda, the sacred text for the Hindu religion. In these scriptures, there is a leader mentioned of the so-called Serbinda, who went westwards with his people. Serbinda, Serb. Again, an undeniable connection to the sickle can be drawn. It is therefore historically or religious biblically and Hindu like this that the facts speak a clear language. The ancestors of the Europeans were the Scythians, which called themselves Serbi in reference to the sickle or the scythe. The only people in the world who still call themselves Serbi are the Serbs. Only they continue to call themselves Serbi. It is also very interesting that the world's leading sinologist, Victor H. Mayer, who is considered by historians to be an ace in his field, wrote in his book Contact and Exchange in the Ancient World the following. When we reconstruct their probable Old Sinitic pronunciation, it must be a word like Serbi. It would appear that Serbi is related to Indo-European words meaning scythe or hook. What a giant statement. That means that even the first Chinese called the scythe and the sickle Serb. They adapted this word from the Japhetites. Archaeological findings of the Saxons, Franks, Greeks, Italians, and so on, who all evolved later from the Indo-European Serbi, also speak a clear language. Indo-Europeans, Indo-Germanic, White Caucasians, Japhetites, Scythians, or even Phrygians. All those words are thus only paraphrased for the ancient Serbi, synonyms, nothing else. And the Serbi were the ancestors of all later European peoples. The ancient Japhethitic Serbi also had a clear conception of God, and they believed in a Trinitarian God. There is again a connection to the Bible, whether you like it or not, because the Bible is the only religious book which speaks of a Trinitarian God. The first Europeans, the Serbi, called their god Serbatius. The two last syllables, Zeus, mean in the old Serbian Indo-European language, God. So the name of their god, Serbatius, translated in English means nothing more than God of the Serbi. The Mycenaean fable deity Zeus also used the Serbian word Zeus. That's why the wording seems to be almost identical. Serbatius, the Trinitarian god of the ancient Serbs, was carved in stone by his believers with a sickle on a horse. And according to the Bible, Jesus will lead the heavenly army on a horse during his second coming. Dear viewers, every child understands that this is the same God. Thousands of years before Jesus lived on earth, thousands of years before the New Testament of the Bible. It is certainly not a matter of coincidence.
In honor to Serbatius, the Trinitarian god of the Japhethitic Serbi, a special greeting was also developed by his believers, which was also symbolically carved in stone. The three-finger greeting, which represents the three pages of God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Around Anatolia, archaeologists found stone figures that confirm these theses very well. And again, only the today's Balkan Serbs are the only people on earth who have retained this greeting. The Germans, who are of course also descendants of the Japhethitic Serbi, are still greeting each other with the greeting of Serbatius, because the very popular Bavarian German greeting Servus is also a variation of the word Serbatius. And the ancient Serbi, of course, also had a coat of arms, the double-headed eagle with the 4 sickles on the chest. Archaeologists found such double-headed eagles also from India to Europe, in the entire settlement area of the ancient Japhetites. Today, in addition to Serbia, a few other states still have this symbol of the double-headed eagle active as their national emblem, whereby Serbia is the only state that still has the 4 sickles on it. The double-headed eagle symbolizes the beginning and the end. Alpha and Omega, if you will.
The common origin of all white Caucasian Europeans has been finally clarified. But why are there so many different languages? And why do the Southern Europeans look different from the Northern Europeans? The answer is alienation. When a people is divided into several groups, it is only a matter of time before linguistic and cultural differences appear. The same is happening today with the Korean people, who were united 100 years ago and now live in a North and a South state. Differences in culture and language are becoming more and more serious. That is how various new subpopulations have gradually emerged within the Serbian ethnic group over time. And over time, they developed new rituals and cultures. The language also changed over the millennia. And the appearance changed especially in Southern Europe due to the periods of mixing with other non-Serbian peoples. You surely remember that Noah, besides Japheth, the forefather of the Serbians, is said to have 2 other sons, Ham and Shem, which had their own sons, who created other tribes. One son of Shem was called Elam, the founder of the Elamites. Elam was a nephew of Japheth according to the Bible. The Elamites are historically recognized and are considered to be the ancestors of today's Dravidians. That is the ethnic group that can be found in present-day India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, although the first people in today's India were, as you know, the Japhetite Serbians. but they moved on westwards. Thus, the Elamites took the area under their control. But why are only the Elamites so relevant now? Well, in the Old Testament, it is described that God was angry with the Elamites and wants to scatter them all over the world and bring disaster upon them. So, if you believe this statement, the appearance of these people also changed. The fact is that the Roma, sometimes called gypsies, are also Elamites. They are considered in the West as the so-called traveling people and often took a slave position with various peoples of the world. In the later course of human history, it is described how Abraham, a very important person in the Bible and in the Quran, besides his two white wives Sarah and Keturah, had a third wife, which was an Elamite slave from the later Egypt. With her, he begot one of his sons, Ishmael, and Ishmael is considered in the Arab mythology as the forefather of the Arabs. The word Arab in the translation means nothing else than the mixed people, mixed because of the two-sided descent, white by the father, Abraham, and dark Elamite by the mother, Hagar. The Arabs then also spread and settled all over the Near and Middle East, as well as North Africa. A bit tricky, I know, but my argument comes immediately. When the European Serbian peoples eventually founded great expanding empires, such as the Roman Empire, Arab citizens in the occupied territories were Roman citizens. They were free to settle in the heart of the empire and to reproduce there with one of their very desirable blue-eyed blonde women. And this is what many Arabs did. That's how once blonde inhabitants of southern Europe became darker. The modern-day Greeks are today also a group of people which looks rather Arabic Elamite than European.
In today's Balkan Serbs, those people, which are the only tribe on earth still defending their Japhethitic Serbian culture, had a similar process. They didn't mix with other tribes as much as the Greeks, for example, but still they have darker hair than the most Northern Europeans. Of course, there are a lot of blue-eyed and blonde Balkan Serbs in today's Serbia, but the majority still have a darker touch, brown eyes, brown hair, and so on. Seen in this way, it is actually so that from the genetics, the Northern European peoples are the purest Serbians, even if they no longer define themselves as such. However, there are also brown-haired Germans or Englishmen or whatever, who also without a doubt had a mixture in at least one of their ancestors. Otherwise, they would also be blue-eyed and blonde. I, as a Serbo-Jew, am of course against any form of racism. Do not misunderstand me right now. But these are the historical facts, and this is what this movie is about.
The darker Elamites are not the only non-Serbian tribe who settled in Europe. In the East, various Sino peoples have been pushing into Europe for thousands of years. These Sino peoples include the Koreans, the Japanese, Chinese, and the Mongols. By the way, the first Turkic peoples were also Mongols. According to the Bible, the Sino peoples are descendants of the legendary Nimrod, the man who built the Tower of Babel. The word Sino derived from an ancient deity in ancient Mesopotamia. So the Sino people, or Nimrod's people, took the name of their moon god for their own self-designation. And these people also got their appearance changed because of this rebellion against God. Somewhat differently than with the Elamites, but the Bible is clear on that. Well, and this can be believed or rejected as an idea. The other theory would say that mutations changed the appearance of these people over a long period of time. This would be part of the theory of evolution. Both theories have their supporters. And for this documentary, it is not really relevant where you position yourself. Due to the constant attack waves of those Sino-Mongolian Turkic tribes over the millennia, many white-looking Serbian women landed in the hands of the attackers. There, they were either enslaved or forced to marry a Turkic Mongolian. This is how many Eastern Europeans got their slightly Mongolian-looking facial features, and sometimes even dark hair and eyes, depending how intense the mixing of their own DNA code has been. The different branches in language and in culture are developed in the course of the millennia due to isolation. Now, I would like, as promised at the beginning, to go into more detail about a very special people, namely the ancient Egyptians. Consciously, I say ancient Egyptians because today's Arab-speaking citizens of the Republic of Egypt have nothing to do with the ancient Egyptians. It was also mentioned that according to the Bible, a certain Mizraim was the founding father of the first people on the territory of today's Egypt. This is proved by hieroglyphs and findings from the later Akkadia, in which of Mizraim as a ruler of his people is the speech. Egypt is called this country today only because there was once a ruler and his name was Aegyptus. Again, it is only about the own ego. However, Aegyptus was not a descendant of Mizraim. Aegyptus was a Minoan, a tribe which emerged from the Ionians and lived on the island which is now called Crete. Aegyptus was, therefore, a Japhetite, a Serb. He was, just like his ruling pharaonic descendants, blue-eyed and blonde.
Now perhaps some of you out there will ask themselves, but why do we have so many generic terms for the individual so-called peoples on the whole world, but this movie is primarily about the Europeans? Basically, why do we define Europeans in the East as Slavs, in the West as Celts, in the North as Germanics, and so on? Well, that's a good question.
The ancient Indo-European Serbi, today in our time, have been divided by historians into 8 different subcategories due to linguistic differences that have formed over the time. But why they picked exactly these terms for the today subcategories of the Serbian people? In the case of the Celts, for example, the people that lived on today's Sicily were named as the so-called Sicels by historians. But now the things are getting ridiculous, because the word Sicels is based on the word Sickle, which means Serb. The mainstream historians are consciously trying here to ignore the obvious, namely that the so-called ancient Sicels called themselves, like all the other Japhetites, Serbi, and even the word Sicily is logically also based on the Serbi. Sicily, Sicels, Sickle, Serbi, Serb. A prime example for the evolution of our language. I continue and would like to draw now the connection to the Celts. In Sicily, according to later Minoan mythology, a special man is said to have lived there. He was extraordinarily tall and was sometimes even described as a giant. Historically, this man is called Polyphemus. Polyphemus had 3 sons: Celtus, Illyrius, and Galatus. You probably already know where I'm trying to get here, right? Celtus was the forefather of the Celts. Galatus and Illyrius the forefathers of the Illyrians and the Galatians, who are unfortunately already assimilated into other subgroups of the Japhetites, and therefore no longer exist by name. Today's Albanians feel themselves to be the cultural descendants of the ancient Illyrians. Some historians reject this thesis, but I tell you, yes, it is quite plausible, because the name of the Albanians, the word Alban, translated means nothing else than white man. And since the brother of Illyrius, Celtos, was the forefather of the Celts, it is even more interesting that today's Scots, a Celtic people, call themselves Albani in their own Scottish or Celtic language. Whites. That's why when people are unnaturally strongly bright, we talk about albinism. The today's Albanians are, however, in many cases no more Albani, thus white, because they also mixed themselves in the course of the millennia with the Elamites and the Senos. Not all, but many. So when the Serbs and the Albanians want to fight again at the next World Cup qualifications, they should always remember that they are actually one and the same people, the Serbian people, the whites, the Albanis. With the Germanics, which got their historical designation in reference to the Japhethitic Gomer, it is a somewhat more tricky history, and even the French are Germanic in the core, since they, as the name already reveals, descend from the Germanic tribe of the Franks. Well, the first Germanic peoples, who are also named as such by mainstream historians, are said to have been the so-called Suebi, who settled in the area of today's East Germany. Later, they also moved to today's northern Spain, but this is not important for now. Nevertheless, I must say that they called themselves Serbi, not Suebi. Suebi is a historical term that the Serbi themselves never used, and from the so-called Suebi, all the later Germanic tribes evolved. It is also interesting that the area of today's East Germany, the motherland of the so-called Suebi, was called Serbia 1400 years ago, with Dresden, Dresdani, as the capital city. Fellow citizens in today's Germany who still feel that they belong to this Serbian state are wrongly described as Sorbs, a recognized ethnic minority in Germany today. But the Sorbs call themselves in their own language, of course, not Sorbs, but Serbi, and the guardian figure in Dresden proudly to this day displays the Serbian Japhethitic coat of arms, the Serbian cross on the skirt. There were also other Japhethitic Serbian peoples in the course of our history, but they were only a kind of intermediate station in a further development as a people, as for example the Caucasians, from which a certain in hell burning dictator, helped himself to the symbols and myths, and even the swastika is only a variation of the Serbian coat of arms, 4 scythes instead of 4 sickles. The Hindus of today and many other peoples on this earth are using this symbol meanwhile also, and have today also all new possible interpretations in stock.
Well, I could talk about the topic till the day after tomorrow, about the connections and the branches of the Europeans, but then I would sit on this chair for 2 whole days. To make it short, I would like to mention certain points again. Yes, the white European people who called themselves Serbi are the ancestors of all Europeans, and of course also the ancestors of all white Caucasian Americans, Canadian, Australians, New Zealanders, logically. But also those of the Hungarians and Finns, even if these are the only Europeans to adopt an Uralic language. The reason why some Southern Europeans are on average somewhat darker than the Northern Europeans is the mixture with the Elamites and the Sino peoples. In mainstream history, people are constantly trying to move around the word Serbi by hook or by crook. They invent new words like Sorbs, Sickles, Sissels, Suebi, and so on. But now you know the truth. Check my statements, look at the sources, and you will realize that I have told you nothing but the truth. Nowadays we have a situation that the Serbi, with their disappearing small birth rate, only make up 2% of the world's population. Something has to change when we don't want to get extinct. I deliberately say us because although I am a Hebrew Semite on my father's side, I feel that I belong to the Japhethitic Serbs. Go and make your children. In the name of Serbatius, Servus.